You guys are going to have a great weekend this weekend. The weather's gorgeous. Enjoy it after you do your history homework. Uh, getting ready to start presentation number 7 about America and the Great War, talking about our involvement in World War I. We've talked in class about how Teddy Roosevelt changed American foreign policy from the Monroe Doctrine, which was very isolationist, to the Roosevelt Corollary, which led us to being more involved with foreign affairs worldwide. Um, World War I changed it forever with our involvement in the devastation that occurred in Europe between 1914 and 1918. So let's get started. When elected to the presidency, Woodrow Wilson admitted that as a college professor, it would be an irony of fate if, quote, my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs. And that's what happened. Foreign affairs, unfortunately, became the prime focus of his administration. We talked a lot about his new freedom, how he wanted to change the tariff and institute the Federal Reserve and make it so that there was a regulation on trusts through the Federal Trade Commission. But what he primarily focused on was problems in Central South America and in Europe. Wilson lacked in experience. He believed he made up for in ideals. I told you that he was a man of ideas. He was all in his head. Everything was theory. He'd been very well educated. He was brilliant. He did not have any real world experience on any of this stuff. He and Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan finally has a national position after losing the presidency 3 times. Believed that it was the United States' religious duty to spread democracy across the world. Excuse me. Mexico had been in revolution for almost 3 years when Wilson took office. Revolution leader Francisco Madero overturned the previous dictator, but after he was assassinated, Wilson tried to back, my name, I can't say these, Venustiano Carranza. It was a faction, and he was trying to back him by removing an arms embargo that they had in place in 1914. But it led to way more problems. It led to something what was called the Tampico incident. In the Tampico incident, American sailors were captured while obtaining supplies in Tampico, Mexico. The situation was diffused when Woodrow Wilson sent ships south. This incident cost America 19 American lives and over 200 Mexican lives. In 1916, Pancho Villa invaded Texas, and Pancho Villa was Carranza's former general, and he was the self-proclaimed representative of the people. Pancho Villa invaded Texas and New Mexico and killed 17 Americans. Wilson dispatched the army to find Pancho Villa in Mexico, but they never ever found him. My great grandparents actually lived in Mexico, and my great grandfather was held at gunpoint by Pancho Villa. So that is my really quick claim to fame in the war with Mexico, or the skirmishes with Mexico. President Taft promoted what he called dollar diplomacy while he was president in the Caribbean by encouraging Americans to invest heavily in Caribbean markets to help stabilize the unstable Caribbean economies. However, when the nations defaulted on their loans, Taft sent in the Marines. Although he disapproved of such action, Woodrow Wilson often had no choice but to send troops to contain the losses. In fact, there was one battle in Nicaragua where civil war would have erupted had the United States military been removed before settling what was going on down there. The presence of U.S. military force in the region only worsened the already prevalent irritation of, quote, Yankee imperialism, and how we were trying to control all of Latin and South America. While there were small skirmishes in the Western Hemisphere, Europe was fighting, quote, the war to end all wars. World War I began when Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian terrorist, assassinated the Crown Prince Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Austria in 1914. When Austria demanded the terrorists who had orchestrated the assassination be turned over to their government, Russia mobilized its army to protect what they considered a sister nation. Germany backed Austria-Hungary, and they moved very quickly into Belgium and France. It very quickly escalated into war because of who was allied with who. And you will see for the rest of U.S. history, it depends on who we're allied with, what wars we get into. Here is a map of who was allied with who at the very beginning of the war. The allies at the beginning of the war were Great Britain, Russia, and France. And the Central Powers at the beginning of the war were Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Um, so the Central Powers, um, and this is hard to explain because you can see from the map that Italy at the beginning was one of the allies, and then halfway through the war, it changes alliances and becomes part of the Central Powers. So make sure you know who is on what side. The Allied powers are known as the Triple Entente, and that's primarily Great Britain, Russia, and France. The Central Powers are known as the Triple Alliance, and they are primarily Germany, Austria, Hungary, and then towards the end of the war, Italy as well. So make sure you know what each of those terms mean and who is allied with who. At the time of the Great War, 30% of all Americans were no more than 2 generations away from their mother countries, and 8 million were of German descent. Most American leaders were pro British from the onset of the war, and President Wilson repeatedly urged Americans to remain neutral in thought as well as in action. That was his plea, that the Americans were going to be able to stay out of the war altogether. Both the Central Powers and the Allies looked to the United States for food and war material. To finance their needs, so both sides were coming to us looking for help. To finance their needs, France and Great Britain requested loans. Knowing that this violated the neutrality of the United States, Wilson quietly approved loans to the Allies to maintain trade and security and to secretly help Britain. So it was a quiet agreement. It wasn't known to the American public that we were secretly helping the British and the French. Before the U.S. entered the war, over $2 billion had been given to the Allies, and only $27 million had been given to Germany. So we were kind of playing both sides, but to maintain our neutrality, but our main loyalty was with the triple entente. All right, where was I? Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Germany declared the area around the British Isles a war zone and warned that any ship entering the area could be attacked by their submarines, which were a new invention used for the first time during World War I. When a British passenger ship, the Lusitania, which you can see in the headline from the New York Times, when the Lusitania was sunk on its way to from New York to London, 128 American lives were lost. Americans were demanding war by this time, but Wilson refused to yield, saying that, quote, there is such a thing as a man too proud to fight. There is such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right, quote, unquote. To cool American passions down at this time, Germany secretly ordered their subs to avoid seeking passenger ships. So I don't think that Germany really wanted the United States to come in because they knew that we would come in on the side of Great Britain. In December of 1914, President Wilson requested the Army and Navy prepare themselves for war. Although he had no intention of asking for a declaration yet, he chose to be ready. To finance this, he asked Congress to raise the income tax to 2%. So, like I said, with the disappearing of the tariff by him passing the Underwood-Simmons tariff as part of his new freedom, they had to find that money somewhere, and they got it through an income tax. In the election of 1916, President Wilson was reelected. He was reelected basically on the idea that he had kept us out of war for 2 years. President Roosevelt wanted to be the Republican candidate in 1916 again, but because of his actions in the 1912 election, where he had created the Bull Moose Party, the party chose Charles Hughes instead. How dare they choose somebody that wasn't a traitor? The Democrats nominated Wilson again. If you can read the signs on the car, the reason that he was reelected is he broke the trusts, he kept us out of war, he is standing for an 8-hour workday. So all of these things that are progressive, in addition to keeping us out of war, those are the reasons that he was reelected. So he won a second term as the president. After his reelection, Wilson again tried to broker peace, but to no avail. When Germany broke its pledge on February 1st, 1917, stating that all vessels would be sunk without warning, Wilson countered by arming his merchant ships. So he started putting guns on just ships that were bringing supplies back and forth. On March 1st, 1917, the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted from German leaders to Mexico. Zimmermann, the German foreign minister, was accused of contacting his Zimmermann, who was the German foreign minister, was accused of contacting the German ambassador in Mexico and asking him to tell the Mexican government that Mexico should join with the Central Powers and attack the United States. In return, if Mexico joined the Central Powers and attacked the United States, then when they won the war, they guaranteed they would return Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona back to Mexico as part of the spoils of war if they defeated the United States. This did not go over well with the United States. This is one of the hundreds of propaganda posters for citizens to support the war effort. They were published at this time to drum up support for the war. But in March 1917, 5 unarmed U.S. merchant ships were sunk by German submarines. So first we have the sinking of the Lusitania. We will talk about that in class. Then we have the Zimmermann telegram, which you will be reading in your document booklet. The final straw was when 5 unarmed U.S. merchant ships were sunk by German submarines. On April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to recognize that a state of war existed between the two nations. Congress agreed, and the United States entered World War I on April 6, 1917. Although the armed forces had been preparing for war, they were not quite ready. The Navy's first role was to protect shipping convoys from America to Great Britain. By providing $3 billion in loans and naval protection for the Allies, America reinvigorated the Allies in Europe. So we send them money and send them ships that they had been bogged down in this horrible trench warfare, which we will also talk about in class. And early detachments of troops led by John Pershing reached Paris on June 26, 1917. Also at this time, it became necessary to coordinate different industries under new government agencies in order to mobilize the country for war. The new agencies included the Food Administration, the Fuel Administration, the War Industries Board. These new agencies helped Americans raise the needed funds, conserve necessary items, and grow their own crops to prevent shortages. The closing off of immigration and the reallocation of 4 million men to the war effort caused a shortage of workers. To find replacements, recruiters went to the South and brought north 400,000 African Americans. Women were also entered the workforce in record numbers. President Wilson created a committee on public information, which was charged with conveying the Allies' war aims to the American people as well as to the enemy, and in an attempt to sap the enemy's morale. This included the making of Hollywood movies like this one, which is called The Beast of Berlin, and sending men charged with delivering 4-minute speeches across the nation to make their case. The war effort soon turned into a witch hunt against German Americans. Anything German was considered bad. German was removed from the common vernacular. You couldn't even say the word. Sauerkraut was changed into the term Liberty cabbage. German measles were called Liberty measles. And dachshunds were renamed Liberty pups. Can you even imagine that? And German was also dropped as a course being taught in schools. No one could even learn it as a second language. The Espionage and Sedition Acts resulted in over 1,000 convictions of disloyalty to the Union. We'll talk about those in class as well. The American forces did not play a major role in the war until 1918. So we declared war in 1917. We really weren't heavily involved until 1918. And by May of that year, 1 million fresh United States troops were in Europe. The effect on the morale of the Allies was significant, having the Americans there. At the Second Battle of the Marne, or the Battle of Rheims, I don't even know how to say it. I need my French brother-in-law here to tell me, where more than 500,000 American troops engaged, and the Germans were rolled back all the way to Belgium. American casualties at the Battle of the Marne were significant, with 26,000 dead and 91,000 injured. The Americans were able to help break the stalemate of trench warfare that was going on in Northern Europe at the time. We'll talk about that in class. At the beginning of the war, Russia was part of the Allies, but in 1917, Vladimir Lenin led a social revolution where the royal family Romanov was killed. Known as the Bolsheviks, the revolutionaries followed the communist teachings of Karl Marx. Lenin negotiated a treaty with Germany, ending their part in the war, and the Eastern Front fell silent. Here's a picture of trench warfare. Basically, the idea of trench warfare was that you would just dig in and face your enemy off from trenches in the ground. And it was very difficult to gain any advantage during trench warfare sites. We're going to talk about one of the major trench warfare battles of World War I in class. It's called the Battle of Verdun. Here's a map of what was going on with on the Western Front. You can see that not much changed. If you look for where it says for the Western Front was in March of 1918, and then how the Germans tried to push a little bit farther west in the spring, and then we pushed back. And by November of 1918, we'd pushed them back even farther. But look how close that is. If you look at the gauge on the bottom, that's about at the biggest point, maybe 60 or 70 miles of territory that they were fighting over. To give you a bit of a gauge, it's about, I don't know, 85 miles to Payson from here. So they were fighting over less territory than it is distance from here to Payson. So putting that into perspective, it was such a minuscule area, and the number of dead who were killed during these battles was incredible. We'll talk about that in class. When a late 1917 peace conference failed, Woodrow Wilson hoped to negotiate his own agreements designed to prevent such a war from ever happening again. Labeled the 14 points, the agreement included freedom of the seas, removal of trade barriers, weapon reduction, and a push for a League of Nations to help keep global peace. In October of 1918, the German government wanted to adopt the 14 points as part of their peace treaty, but the victorious Allied powers viewed the points as a source merely to begin negotiating. It wasn't the end of negotiating, including in the discussion of who would pay for the war. The war was the most expensive in history up to that point. The war was still going on, although the end was in sight. Bulgaria, Turkey, Austria-Hungary, and Italy had all dropped out of the war by this point. So it was just the main powers left negotiating what they wanted to do. During the 19 months of participation in the war, the United States lost 126,000 of its servicemen. They were killed. Germany's war dead totaled over 2 million, including civilians. France lost nearly 1.4 million combatants. The United Kingdom lost over 700,000 soldiers, and Russia lost 1.7 million soldiers. The new Europe, emerging from the conflagration, which would be very much different. What came after World War I was much more violent, more polarized, more cynical, less sure of itself, and less capable of decisive action. The United States, for good or ill, would be sucked into the vacuum of power created by the destructiveness of the end of World War I. When the Paris Peace Conference began on January 18th of 1919, Woodrow Wilson decided that he wanted to attend the peace negotiations. No U.S. president had ever left the country while in office, and doing so dramatized all the more Wilson's messianic vision and his goal of a lasting peace. How he was the hero, how it was the United States' Christian duty to extend democracy through the world. While he was there, many leaders from the various countries in attendance started to discuss peace arrangements. The main contributors were the Big Four, and those Big Four are in this picture up above. They are Woodrow Wilson, who is, you can see him, he's the taller guy, not the guy with the beard, but the next guy from the left without a cane. That's Woodrow Wilson. In the middle is Georges Clemenceau from France, and on the right is Arthur Balfour from Great Britain, and then the other one was the leader from Germany, who is on the left of President Wilson. Let's see, where were we? In Wilson's mind, the cornerstone of the points was this idea of a League of Nations. No, it's actually not the German guy, it's the Italian guy. Sorry, I said the wrong thing. Anyway, a place where the nations could settle their disputes by diplomacy, not war. The League of Nations included a council made up of the 5 main countries, which would be Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States, 4 rotating other members of the council, a secretariat consisting of the administration staff in Switzerland, and the Permanent Court of International Justice, which was basically a world court. 6 months later, when the treaty was finished, Wilson returned to a defiant Senate in the United States who refused to ratify it. Like I said, they ticked everybody off because he left the United States for so long. They felt like he had abandoned them. During his prolonged trip abroad, he lost touch with political developments at home, where his political coalition was already unraveling under the pressures of wartime discontent. And there's nothing he could do about it. He was very frustrated, even though he felt like this was the best solution. The Treaty of Versailles from 1918-1919 is the peace that is negotiated to stop World War I and negotiating with Germany. The Treaty of Versailles symbolized the end of the war. It was not a quick process to create this treaty. It was long and bitter. France demanded reparation payments from Germany for the damages the war had caused. The crippling repayments for reparations would also keep Germany weak and unable to rise economically. Again, one of the things that the Allies were hoping for. Germany was divided into new nations with areas that would serve as buffer states. If you look at this map, that's what the purple parts are the buffer states between to help protect other countries from Germany invading. Anyway, so they had buffer states if they were, so that would help prevent them from becoming aggressive again. Yeah, tell Hitler that. The German delegation was not allowed to partake in these talks, but were present. They were presented with a final document, and because they were allowed no voice in the negotiations, because they were the losers of the war, they were very bitter with this treaty. A lot of historians believe that the Treaty of Versailles was the mark of the beginning of World War II. That World War II would be inevitable because of how Germany had not been allowed to have a voice in how peace was declared. What I was going to say, sorry, I just lost my train of thought again. In the United States, when Congress declared the war at an end by a joint congressional resolution, Wilson vetoed the action in 1918 because he really wanted them to sign the Treaty of Versailles. He wanted them to join the League of Nations. It was not until after he left office that a joint congressional resolution officially ended the state of war with Germany and Austria-Hungary in the United States in 1921. But there was not any battle going on or anything. Just the official treaty wasn't signed until then. Peace treaties with Germany, Austria, and Hungary were ratified on October 18, 1921. But by then, Warren Harding was president of the United States, and it was completely irrelevant. It's kind of funny that this was such a cantankerous moment in Congress that it was years after the war was over that peace was even formally declared. With the war over, society and industry had to revert to their pre-war status. But with the returning soldiers came new problems. There were cancellations of war contracts, returning soldiers to civilian life, and what jobs were they going to have, and the missing leadership of Woodrow Wilson. Also came the Spanish flu. The population of the world in 1912 was 1.77 billion. The Spanish flu was a pandemic that lasted a year, and 22 million would die globally from this strain of the flu. Add to that the casualties of war, and 33 million people lost their lives in 5 years worldwide. Think about that. 33 million people died between war and the flu. And double the number died because of the Spanish flu. So that's kind of crazy. Released from wartime constraints, the workers began to strike for their demands. The largest strike was the U.S. steel strike in 1919, resulting in 340,000 workers walking off the job. Eventually, the workers won and returned to work. In 1919, race riots occurred throughout the country. Whites in Longview, Texas invaded the black side of town to find a black man who was accused of allegedly dating a white woman. Washington, D.C. was mobbed by white and black gangs for 4 days until soldiers in a rainstorm ended the riot. So on top of these race problems, there was a fear of what had occurred in Russia could also occur in the United States, and this promoted the first Red Scare. Wartime hysteria over everything German soon found another roost in all things communist. Militants mailed bombs to prominent members of the government, and everyone was in a state of unrest for about a year and a half because of the first Red Scare. That's the end of this presentation. We're going to talk about World War I in class next time after we do our class challenge of populism and progressivism, and then we'll talk about World War I again the end of this week. So make sure you've got notes, make sure you have read your document booklet, and I will see you in class. Have a great weekend.